Tomorrow, the House of Lords will be voting on the government's policing, crime, sentencing and courts bill. This is a controversial bill that many have argued represents a grave threat to civil liberties. I'm joined now by Claire Fox, also known as Baroness Fox of Buckley, who will be speaking in the Lords tomorrow about this very bill. Claire, thank you for joining me today. Now, of course, the government is trying to clamp down on certain forms of protest. Isn't this just in the wake of Insulate Britain and all the trouble that they caused? I mean, you can see why something needs to be done.
I do understand that there's a real popular and public frustration at the very nihilistic forms of protest deployed by the likes of Extinction Rebellion. But sort something out. The amendments that the government originally brought into this bill to basically ban our right to protest were to do with giving the police more power to stop protests based on a noise trigger. Now, I don't know if you've ever come across any Extinction Rebellions, but they can actually be quite quiet.
I've been at one. I would not to participate, but I've been at one to report, and they're very civilised.
Exactly.
Actually.
So the issue is not noise. So why have they introduced that noise trigger? And that noise trigger, by the way, is really damaging because it goes to the heart of why you're protesting, which is you have to make your voices heard if you're outside of Parliament or wherever you are. You're trying to make a case, aren't you? So the noise trigger gives the police huge powers, which is very dangerous. And along the way, it says things like that if you go on a protest that is too noisy, you ought to have known it was going to be too noisy, and you can be criminalised for an ought-to-know basis. I mean, this is really draconian and terrible.
At the heart of our democracy is freedom to protest, freedom to assembly. This is important stuff.
So the reason I'm saying that is because there are plenty of present pieces of legislation, goodness knows, they've got an armoury of legislation that they could use against Extinction Rebellion, against protest they don't want or whatever, if they think that they are actually not protests at all, but actually disrupting everyday life. But I think that we have to be careful because I don't want to get to a point where I'm saying I don't like those protesters, so I want them to be stopped. Because if you look at all of the conditions that are being imposed by amendments at the moment, it will give the police and the Home Secretary enormous power to decide that protest is OK, that protest isn't. And
that is disturbing, isn't it? Because particularly if it's a protest against the government. But, I mean, if you think back to, after Cable Street and you had the Labour Party pushing through the Public Order Act, that legislation was used against left-wing activists largely throughout the century.
So you've got a number of extra things. The government then did this sneaky thing, which is they then brought in some amendments that did actually relate to Extinction Rebellion.
Okay.
They've introduced some proposals to ban things like locking on. Well, it's very vague, but it would mean, if you tie yourself to a tree or a motorway or what have you.
So that's very specifically about
you at least understand that.
Yeah.
Except in the wake of that, they then bring in these things called, I've got to get this right, Serious Disruption Prevention Orders, SDPOs. And what that means is that you can be a named individual who can be banned from going on any demonstration if you've been on a demonstration twice before and they didn't like your activity.
Really?
I know, they're exactly. Protest banning orders, effectively, and with incredibly broad remit. They're also bringing in stop and search. Stop and search without suspicion. Now, stop and search has only ever been used for very serious criminal activity. I mean, if you think that, for example, somebody's going to be a terrorist or knife crime's about to take place. But they're now bringing in stop and search for somebody who you might be going on a demonstration, which isn't a criminal activity, remember?
No.
And even without suspicion. So I really want to urge the viewers to take an interest in what's happening in the House of Lords tomorrow. This second lot of amendments they brought in were only introduced in the House of Lords really to avoid parliamentary scrutiny, by the way. That then gives go on.
Because I'm interested about that, because this has been going on for a long time. I remember reading about this months and months ago,
that's right,
and I remember specifically reading about the idea that if the protest was too noisy, the police would have the right to shut. So that's an old thing. What are these new amendments, and when did they come in?
So I think the new amendments came in when they realised that the other amendments bore no relationship to Extinction Rebellion or the things that people were complaining about. So they brought these new amendments in just a few weeks ago, very late at night. I mean, it was like literally at the end of what is known as committee stage in the House of Lords, which gave no one any time to scrutinise them. They're now coming back in the final part of this bill. But what it means is that the House of Lords, and this is rare, gets an opportunity to actually stop them in their tracks. So if, in fact, the House of Lords vote down these amendments, then they actually have to go They have to start again in a new bill. So it will be... and I hope that they are voted down. Just in terms of the way the politics works, by the way, the Labour Party have now eventually been persuaded to support the Lib Dems, the Greens, crossbenchers and the odd independent like me, to oppose these different attacks on the right to protest. But just to show you the inconsistency, only last week they introduced public space protection order bans on any anti-vaccine protests around schools or vaccination centres because they don't like anti-vax protests. Yeah. Even though some of those, by the way, anti-vaccine protests might be parents saying they don't want their children to be vaccinated without consent. So it's not straightforwardly anti-vax.
Yeah.
But I think it shows you that amongst the political parties anyway, there's a certain inconsistency when it comes to which protests they like and which ones they don't like.
Right, well, that seems to be the problem, doesn't it? It's about which causes they happen to support.
Yeah.
But why do you think the government is doing this? What's in it for them at the moment? Why push this through now?
Well, I think they think it's popular because there has been a completely understandable revulsion against the way that, for example, ambulances weren't able to get through when people were blocking roads and the whole protests on the motorways when people were trying to get to work. So they think they're doing something popular. I actually think it's a hangover from the lockdown period. I mean, They kind of have got away with amassing a huge amount of power. It gives them the ability to intervene, and they just think they'll pull that off. And they have that power, they won't always use it. And I suppose the final thing that we should note is it shows to me a real collapse of authorities that don't really trust the police to police anymore. It seems there is a crisis in policing. I mean, you've talked about the Colston 4 before now and what's happening in relation to that. But I think that when you actually muddle up politics and the particular political issues with what your rights are and so on and so forth, they then think, we've got to clamp down on this, we've got to make sure that we've got some consistency, and they don't trust the police to do it, so they've just brought in a whole range of new laws, or they're trying to, that will mean that you can't move, but for them having the power to stop you protesting.
Well, isn't that a real problem at a time when the police seem to be becoming more politicised, as far as I can see?
I think this will only encourage that, because if you give the police a huge amount of discretion to decide what triggers a noisy protest, which presumably, hopefully, if you're organising the protest, it's going to be noisy, right?
Yeah,
but then if they say, oh, no, well, that might cause some distress or annoyance to a local company or a local group of people, it obviously gives them a huge amount of discretion, doesn't it? So they could say, we will ban that protest, not that protest, and they will be accused of politicising protests and what's banned. Interestingly, the police don't seem to want this discretion. I mean, they have actually been no demands for on their behalf.
It puts them in a very difficult position, doesn't it? Because firstly, how do you assess whether a protest is too loud or will cause offence or anything else? I mean, surely it's in the police's interests to sustain their non-partisan
exactly,
approach,
and it puts them right in the eye of making those decisions. The funny thing was, I went about finding out what too noisy meant and checking on decibels and working it all out. Of course, this is not in the law, and I said, imagine your average copper standing around going, will this be too loud? And so it's entirely discretionary. So there's far too much of this bill, which is giving far too much power to the police, but it's far too vague to protect our civil liberties. I think it's worth noting, the right to protest isn't a gift for the government to give us. It's our right to protest. Right? It is a legal right, and it's a very important civil liberty. And they're behaving as though, well, of course you can have the right to protest, as long as you do it where we say, in the way that we say, in a very civilised way, not using methods that we don't like. And I think that will damage anyone. So even if anyone watching thinks, I can't stand that crowd who have protested on this, I don't like the Black Lives Matter lot, we have to defend the right to protest, because there'll be something in your life that you will want to protest over one day. And if the government are going to use anti-democratic means to pass secondary legislation and impose all sorts of attacks on our freedoms, then we're going to need the right to protest even more moving forward. So don't let them get away with this.
Well, this is why I mentioned the Public Order Act, because the people who pushed it through, it ended up clamping down on things they hadn't anticipated. And this isn't just about Insulate Britain. We don't know how this legislation is going to be applied in the future. It's probably going to be applied against things that we support.
There'll be different Home Secretaries who have different politics. So you might think, oh, I don't mind Pretty and her priorities. But if you give the power to the Home Secretary, it's whichever Home Secretary. And you might find, I mean, I don't necessarily agree with British priorities, but that's not my point. The point is you give a huge amount of power for the Home Secretary, because they get, in this bill, get given the choice They can decide what is a disruptive protest, effectively, as well as the police.
That's too much power. I mean, but do you think a lot of this has come about because of some of the more, let's say, in-your-face kind of protests around Parliament Square? Certain politicians have been subject to abuse up close by protesters. Do you think there's a sensitivity around that now that's come off the bat?
Yes, because you might well be right, because they're actually extending the buffer zone around Parliament as a no-protest zone. They're saying they're not doing that, but they are actually changing the geographic place where you are allowed to protest.
And that's within these new amendments?
Within the new amendments.
Oh, right.
Or within the first lot of amendments, but anyway. They're even making it much easier to arrest and criminalise one-person protests. Now, of course, we all know that there are some very loud... I mean, I have been subjected to quite a lot of the kind of Remain-supporting one-man protest bands who scream my name out as I walk past and kind of accuse me because of Brexit and all that sort of
They can be quite loud, then.
They're loud, they're irritating, they get on my nerves. Should they be criminalised and arrested? Absolutely not. And politicians need to be able to go about their work without being overly harassed, but they can't protect themselves. I mean, they say, this government, that they think that students are Generation Snowflake if they hide away in safe spaces, but they're trying to create Parliament into a safe space and hide away from the public.
Well, isn't the point of protest to be annoying?
I know.
You're trying to annoy someone.
I know. I annoy people and make your case heard. I mean, that is the point. Yes, they're inevitably going to annoy somebody, aren't they? That's why you're protesting. And let's remember that every single protest, or rather, every single civil liberty that we now have, we gained because somebody else protested once, and it will have annoyed somebody.
Yes.
And the government didn't want to hear the protesters. They didn't want to know about why we should decriminalise homosexuality. They didn't want to know why we should have equal rights for people from different ethnicities. They didn't want the suffragettes to have the women's vote. They didn't want the universal suffrage to happen. Go away, you annoying little plebs, they would think to themselves. We don't want to be annoyed by your noisy protests. But luckily, historically, ordinary people took the opportunity to make loud their protests, and we have gained. So don't let them take away our right to protest, because they use opportunistically just tell you, oh, we're only doing it to get rid of those annoying Extinction Rebellion people. However annoyed you are about them, and they annoy me, I can tell you now, that is not the basis on which we should let them take away our fundamental right to protest.
Well, it's very fascinating, and good luck tomorrow in the House of Lords.
Watch Parliament TV, of course, not at the expense of GB News.
Of course
but
not.
do keep your eye on what's happening in the House of Lords tomorrow. For once, that unelected place is actually important to keep your eye on.
Claire Fox, thanks very much for joining me.